Scouse Jack and the man known only as the Broker had ruled Liverpool's streets in silence, their empire built on fear, money, and secrets. But when loyalty cracked and betrayal surfaced, the city became a battlefield no one saw coming. Liverpool was a city built on history, a place where ships once carried goods, dreams and fortunes across oceans. But by the late 1990s, the same docks that once fueled Britain's glory had become gateways for a darker trade. Containers that used to hold textiles and machinery now carried drugs worth millions, slipping through unnoticed amid the chaos of global shipping. The city's transformation was slow, quiet, and invisible to most. On the surface, Liverpool thrived. Music poured from its pubs, the football stadiums were alive with passion, and new buildings rose along the waterfront. Yet behind the noise, a silent economy was growing. A network of small-time criminals, desperate for money and power, began to see the docks not as history, but as opportunity. It started with petty dealers selling in nightclubs and on street corners, earning fast cash and attracting the attention of those higher up the chain. Unemployed dock workers and corrupt customs agents became part of the growing system. They knew the routes, the paperwork, and the weaknesses in security. Slowly, a structure began to form, unorganized at first, but expanding like a web. Each strand connected dealers, importers and enforcers, all feeding off the city's poverty and ambition. The police were aware of an increase in drug circulation but couldn't trace its source. Arrests were made, but every small dealer caught was easily replaced by another. The violence came later. Turf wars broke out between local gangs fighting for control of the streets, and those who lost disappeared. The bodies that turned up in alleyways or canals were reminders of a quiet war that no one wanted to talk about. Ordinary people avoided looking too long, avoided asking questions, and learned to mind their own business. Fear was not shouted in the streets, it was whispered behind closed doors. Families of victims rarely spoke to the police, not out of loyalty to criminals, but out of pure survival. Beneath the surface, the structure of organized crime was taking shape. Smugglers worked hand in hand with money launderers, using small businesses and offshore accounts to wash illegal profits clean. Luxury cars and nightclubs became symbols of status for men who had risen from nothing. The city's underworld was no longer defined by brute strength alone. Intelligence and strategy had become the new weapons. Rumors began spreading about a mysterious figure who was bringing order to the chaos, a man or group known only by whispers. The criminal world that once relied on chaos now moved with precision. By the early 2000s, Liverpool had unknowingly become one of the UK's main entry points for international drug trafficking. Shipments arrived from South America, North Africa, and mainland Europe, disguised as legal goods. Every successful delivery strengthened the hidden network, pulling in more money, more connections, and more danger. The balance of power in the city had shifted permanently. While politicians spoke proudly about Liverpool's regeneration, the underworld was building an empire of its own, silent, ruthless, and unstoppable. The war for control had begun, but most people didn't even know it existed. The rise of the Broker marked the beginning of a new era in Liverpool's underworld. No one knew his real name or where he came from. Some said he was a former businessman who turned to crime after bankruptcy. Others believed he had been part of a European cartel before settling in the city. What made him dangerous wasn't his violence but his vision. He saw what others didn't. That the scattered gangs fighting over pennies could become something far greater if united under one system. He began reaching out to smaller crews, offering them protection, money, and a share in larger shipments. For the first time, Liverpool's criminals were working together instead of destroying each other. The Broker had created order in a place defined by chaos. He didn't run the streets himself. Instead, he used layers of trusted lieutenants to handle operations. Each one managed a sector of the city, collecting cash, controlling dealers, and enforcing rules. Violence was still part of the business, but it became strategic, not reckless. Every attack had a reason. Every killing sent a message. Rival gangs that refused to cooperate were wiped out swiftly. In just a few years, the broker had transformed Liverpool's drug scene into a structured network that resembled a corporation more than a street gang. Through his influence, shipments began arriving with military precision. Cocaine from Colombia, heroin from Turkey, and synthetic drugs from Eastern Europe flowed into the city's ports hidden in containers of frozen seafood, electronics, and clothing. Once inside, the drugs were distributed across the UK through an intricate network of couriers, drivers, and stash houses. The money came back through car dealerships, real estate companies, and construction firms, all seemingly legitimate. The broker operated in complete secrecy, ensuring that even those closest to him rarely knew his true location. He communicated through encrypted phones, coded emails, and offshore intermediaries. What made him untouchable was his ability to mix crime with business. He built relationships with corrupt customs officials who turned a blind eye to certain shipments. Dock workers were paid off to ignore suspicious containers, and accountants were hired to make the numbers look right on paper. With every successful operation, his influence spread. Local gang leaders who once ruled their neighborhoods with fear now answered to him. The streets were quieter, but the silence was deceptive. It was the silence of control. Police intelligence began noticing patterns they couldn't explain. Arrested dealers stopped talking. Evidence vanished from storage. Court cases collapsed without reason. There were whispers inside the force that someone powerful was manipulating the system from within. Yet there was no trace of the broker, no photograph, no fingerprint, no solid lid. By 2010, Liverpool's criminal landscape had changed completely. The days of chaotic street violence were replaced by a cold, calculated empire that generated millions each month. The broker had built something the police had never faced before, a criminal organization that ran like a business and hid like a ghost. The city was now under one rule, and most people didn't even know who ruled it. The broker's empire thrived for years, spreading quietly through Liverpool's streets and into neighboring cities. But success always breeds envy, and soon the peace he had built began to fracture. Smaller gangs, once obedient under his control, started to question why they received only scraps while the broker's lieutenants lived like kings. Greed and resentment started to boil beneath the surface. It began with whispers, secret meetings, small thefts from shipments, and a few missing envelopes of cash. Then one winter night, a convoy carrying several kilos of cocaine was hijacked on the outskirts of the city. 3 men were found dead in a burned-out van the next morning. That single act tore open the fragile silence that had held Liverpool together for years. The broker's response was swift and brutal. Within a week, houses were raided by masked men, and several known street figures vanished without a trace. Their bodies turned up days later, dumped in remote fields outside the city. The message was clear. Betrayal came with a price. But instead of restoring fear, the violence sparked more rebellion. Rival gangs from Manchester and Birmingham sensed weakness and began moving in, offering cheaper drugs and tempting disloyal members with higher profits. Suddenly, the well-oiled machine the broker had built was under siege from all sides. The streets of Liverpool turned red. Shootings became a nightly occurrence. Cars exploded outside pubs, and entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. Innocent people caught in the crossfire stopped going out after dark. Mothers warned their sons to stay away from the corners, but by then, the city's young generation had already been pulled into the underworld. For many, the gang life was not a choice but a survival strategy. The broker's enforcers ruled through terror, but they were losing control as their numbers thinned. Police reports described the violence as a wave unlike anything the region had seen in decades. Despite the chaos, the broker himself remained invisible. Law enforcement believed he was no longer in the country, running operations remotely through encrypted communications, but his influence was still felt in every act of revenge, every killing, and every shipment that somehow continued to move despite the bloodshed. The silent war had fully begun, not just between gangs but between loyalty and greed. Detectives working organized crime units struggled to make sense of it all. Every lead they followed led to another dead end or another body, Fear silenced witnesses, and even those willing to talk often disappeared before they could testify. The broker's empire, though wounded, refused to collapse. It adapted, like a living organism protecting itself from attack. Behind closed doors, a few surviving lieutenants began planning their own moves, each hoping to seize control if the broker ever fell. By the end of that bloody year, Liverpool had become a city divided by invisible borders. No one ruled it entirely, yet no one dared to claim it openly. The silent war had reached its peak, a war without soldiers' uniforms or battlefields, but one fought in alleyways, docks, and council estates, leaving a trail of fear that stained every corner of the city. As the violence continued to spiral, investigators began to notice strange patterns in how certain operations were being protected. Shipments that should have been intercepted by customs passed through without inspection. Court cases against known traffickers suddenly collapsed due to missing evidence. Names of suspects disappeared from active files, and confidential informants were exposed before their testimonies could be heard. It became clear to a handful of detectives that the broker's empire was not just surviving through fear, it was being shielded from the inside. The corruption was spreading deeper than anyone had imagined, reaching into the very institutions meant to stop it. A special intelligence task force was formed quietly, separate from local police channels. They began mapping connections between known gang associates, shipping companies, and financial accounts. What they discovered was staggering. Millions of pounds were being funneled through offshore bank accounts, linked to fake construction firms, real estate developments, and even charity organizations. The broker's network had found ways to turn dirty cash into legitimate wealth. Some of the most luxurious developments along Liverpool's waterfront were funded through laundered drug money, their glass walls and polished stone hiding years of blood and crime. Digging deeper, investigators uncovered links to politicians, lawyers, and business owners who had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, helped keep the system running. Bribes were passed as consulting fees, and campaign donations were exchanged for favors. The line between legality and crime blurred until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The broker had built an empire that did not rely solely on fear. It relied on influence. Every person who took his money, every official who ignored a suspicious document, became part of his invisible army. Inside police circles, frustration grew. Raids that were planned in secrecy were compromised within hours. Suspects fled moments before officers arrived. Documents critical to ongoing cases went missing from evidence rooms. A few detectives began to suspect that someone high-ranking within law enforcement was feeding information directly to the broker's men. But without proof, they could do nothing. The broker's reach had turned the city's justice system into a maze of shadows and silence. Meanwhile, the media began reporting on the rise of unexplained wealth among local businessmen. Expensive cars lined the driveways of men who had no visible sources of income. Lavish parties in hidden mansions showcased a level of luxury that couldn't be explained by legitimate work, yet no one spoke out publicly. Reporters who investigated too deeply found their sources disappearing, their stories killed before publication. Fear didn't just rule the streets anymore, it ruled the truth itself. By 2015, Liverpool had become a city living two lives. One was bright, full of regeneration projects, tourism, and progress. The other was buried beneath it, running on cash, corruption, and intimidation. For every building that went up, another secret deal was made in the shadows, and at the center of it all was the broker, unseen but ever present, quietly turning the city's future into his personal empire. Every empire eventually cracks, and for the broker, that moment came from within his own trusted circle. Among his closest men was Scouse Jack, a street-born enforcer who had risen through the ranks with ruthless efficiency. Jack had always been loyal, or so everyone believed, but as the broker's power grew, Jack began to feel increasingly shut out. He saw others living lavishly while he was kept in the background, still cleaning up the messes that kept the empire safe. Pride turned to bitterness, and bitterness turned to ambition. Jack believed he deserved more than orders and crumbs. Quietly, he started to build his own connections, reaching out to rival figures in Manchester and Birmingham who were eager to break into Liverpool's territory. What started as small exchanges of information soon became a betrayal that would shake the entire empire. Jack leaked details about shipments, safe houses and storage sites to competing gangs. At first no one noticed, a few missing packages, a failed delivery, nothing unusual in such a volatile business. But as the losses mounted, suspicion began to grow. Millions were disappearing, and with every hit the broker's network grew weaker. Violence erupted again as lieutenants turned against each other, each desperate to prove their loyalty by finding the traitor. What none of them knew was that the police had been watching quietly in the background, tracking every call, meeting and bank transfer. They had finally found their opening. Unbeknownst to the gang, law enforcement had already marked Scouse Jack as a potential informant. Using surveillance technology, they intercepted his encrypted messages and traced his movements across multiple cities. Through him, they mapped the entire structure of the broker's network, names, routes, and operations that had remained hidden for over a decade. For the first time, authorities had the evidence they needed to bring down the empire. But before they could make their move, the broker discovered Jack's betrayal. The retribution was swift and merciless. One night, Jack vanished without warning. His car was found abandoned near the docks, the keys still in the ignition. No body was ever recovered, but everyone knew what that meant. The broker's empire, however, was already bleeding. Jack's disappearance didn't erase the damage he'd caused. Rumors of his cooperation with the police spread through the ranks like wildfire. Paranoia consumed the inner circle. No one trusted anyone anymore. Meetings were cancelled, phones were destroyed, and lieutenants started turning on each other, each fearing they might be next. For years the organization had thrived on loyalty and control, but now it was crumbling under the weight of suspicion. The police watched carefully as the empire began to collapse from the inside. What they didn't realize was that the broker had anticipated this moment. Before the chaos reached its peak, he withdrew quietly, moving assets and disappearing from public view. He left behind confusion, fear, and a fractured empire fighting for control. Liverpool's underworld, once united under one ruler, was now devouring itself. The silence that once protected the broker had turned into the sound of his world falling apart, and yet no one could find him. By 2018, the situation in Liverpool had reached a breaking point. Years of hidden corruption, unsolved murders, and rising drug-related violence had left the city scarred. Law enforcement knew they could no longer rely on traditional methods. The broker's network was too vast, too intelligent, and too deeply woven into the system, so they built something new, an operation unlike anything Merseyside police had ever attempted. It was called Operation Tide, a coordinated strike designed to dismantle the entire empire in one sweeping move. Planning took months, involving the National Crime Agency, Interpol, and law enforcement from Spain and the Netherlands. Every phone call, every shipment, every unexplained cash transfer was monitored, analyzed, and logged. They weren't just chasing the dealers on the streets anymore. They were hunting the architects who had turned Liverpool into one of Europe's key drug gateways. The turning point came when detectives gained access to encrypted phones used by gang members. The devices, thought to be untraceable, contained coded conversations about upcoming shipments, money laundering routes, and even internal disputes. Once decrypted, they exposed a web of crime stretching far beyond Liverpool. The messages revealed links to major European cartels, offshore bankers, and brokers in Dubai. Each new piece of evidence pulled the curtain back on the vast machinery the broker had built over more than a decade. For investigators, it was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Raids began in the early hours of a cold March morning. Dozens of addresses were hit simultaneously across Liverpool, Manchester, and overseas. Police helicopters circled above as armed officers smashed through reinforced doors, seizing drugs, weapons, and cash. Hidden compartments in warehouses revealed cocaine bricks stamped with foreign cartel markings. Bank accounts were frozen, shell companies dissolved, and dozens of suspects arrested. Years of silent surveillance had led to a single moment of chaos, as the empire's core was torn apart. The operation didn't stop there. Agents in Spain and the Netherlands moved in at the same time, capturing key figures who had fled abroad. For the first time, the broker's network faced real destruction. But despite the success, something didn't feel right. The broker himself remained missing. No name, no face, no trail. Investigators found evidence that he had anticipated the operation weeks before it launched. Some believed he had been tipped off by someone inside law enforcement, while others thought he had simply been too clever to be caught. Offshore records showed that large sums of money had been withdrawn and transferred to accounts in unknown territories shortly before the raids. It was as if the mastermind had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only fragments of an empire. As the dust settled, Operation Tide was hailed as a major victory. Millions in assets were seized, and dozens of key players faced long prison sentences. Yet beneath the celebration, unease lingered. Many officers believed that while they had crippled the network, they hadn't truly ended it. The broker's shadow still hung over the city, silent, watching, waiting. The empire had fallen, but the man who built it was still free, somewhere out there perhaps planning his next move. The trial that followed Operation Tide became one of the most complex and closely watched cases in UK criminal history. For months, the courtroom was packed with law enforcement officials, journalists, and families of victims, all waiting to see the empire laid bare. Prosecutors presented mountains of evidence, documents, intercepted messages, and recordings that detailed the scale of Liverpool's drug network. Each exhibit revealed the meticulous planning behind every shipment, every money transfer, and every act of violence. It was a city's criminal life laid out on a table, a stark contrast to the bustling streets above, where life seemed to carry on normally. The most shocking revelation came when prosecutors exposed the structure of the broker's organization. For years, investigators had believed that a single enigmatic man controlled the empire from the shadows, yet documents and phone records revealed something far more cunning. The identity of the broker had been a carefully constructed illusion. Multiple men had operated under one persona, using voice changers, false passports, and digital manipulation to create the idea of an untouchable mastermind. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors explained how this collective had coordinated every operation, ensuring that no single person could be traced back to the full scope of the network. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Former lieutenants, dealers, and accountants testified, many under witness protection, revealing the inner workings of a system that had seemed invisible for over a decade. Details emerged about offshore accounts in Dubai, Spain, and Switzerland, used to launder millions in drug money. Corrupt officials, from port authorities to low-level politicians, were implicated in protecting shipments and silencing investigations. Each revelation exposed the extraordinary reach of the broker's influence and the extent to which fear and bribery had controlled the city. Yet even with these breakthroughs, the case was far from simple. Defense attorneys worked tirelessly to discredit witnesses, challenge evidence, and question the authenticity of intercepted communications. The multiple identities of the broker added layers of complexity, making it almost impossible to pin ultimate responsibility on a single individual. While two of the men behind the broker persona were captured and charged, the third, the one believed to have masterminded the operation, disappeared just days before the final arrests. His vanishing left a haunting uncertainty. Had the true architect of Liverpool's underworld ever been caught, or had he slipped through the authorities' fingers once again? The trial became a national spectacle, shining a light on a world most people never imagined existed. News outlets covered every detail, from the drug shipments to the violent reprisals against informants. Public fascination mixed with fear, as citizens realized that the empire had operated in their own city without detection for years. Families who had lost loved ones found partial closure, though the absence of the primary broker kept the threat alive in their minds. By the time the trial concluded, dozens had been sentenced to long prison terms, and millions in assets had been confiscated. Yet the story ended with a chilling truth. While the network had been severely weakened, the man at its center or one of the men at its center had vanished. Liverpool's silent war had been disrupted, but not fully defeated. The empire had lost some of its teeth, but the shadow of the broker remained, a ghostly presence reminding everyone that power could be hidden, yet still deadly, even when the world believed it had been captured. Years after Operation Tide, Liverpool appeared calm on the surface. The streets no longer echoed with nightly gunfire, and the media painted a picture of progress and regeneration. But beneath the city's renewed facade, the scars of the silent war remained. Many of the broker's former lieutenants were behind bars, but others had quietly returned to the streets, using the lessons they had learned to rebuild connections without drawing attention. Neighborhoods that had once been dominated by open turf wars now operated under a subtler form of control, a network that ran quietly, invisibly, and dangerously. The empire had not vanished, it had simply changed its form. Whispers of a new leader began circulating among those still involved in the drug trade. Some claimed the missing third broker, the one who had eluded capture during the trial, had returned from abroad, operating with even greater caution and cunning. Others believed it was a completely new figure, someone who had studied the original empire and was now exploiting the gaps left behind. Either way, the strategies had shifted. Shipments were smaller, more frequent, and harder to trace. Deals were conducted in encrypted messages and through third-party intermediaries. Violence was no longer a public spectacle, but a calculated tool used only when absolutely necessary. The city's authorities remained vigilant, but the lessons from Operation Tide had revealed the limitations of even the most sophisticated investigations. The broker's network had taught criminals to anticipate law enforcement, to hide in plain sight, and to exploit loopholes in the system. While arrests still occurred, they were often minor figures, pawns in a larger game that the authorities could never fully map. In many ways, Liverpool had become a city of dual realities, one of apparent normality and another of hidden operations, invisible to the public eye but omnipresent to those involved. The local community lived with a quiet tension. Parents warned their children about the allure of quick money. Neighborhoods watched unfamiliar faces warily, and business owners learned to navigate a world where a single wrong decision could bring ruin. The memory of the silent war was never far from conversations. Even years later, families of those who had disappeared or been killed still wondered about the true extent of the empire, and the shadow of the broker lingered in every untouchable corner of the city. International observers noted Liverpool as a case study in organized crime, but the lessons applied globally. The broker's methods, creating a collective persona, exploiting corruption, and blending crime with legitimate business, had been replicated in cities across Europe. While the UK's authorities had dismantled the visible network, the principles of the empire had not died. Criminals adapted, learned, and evolved, demonstrating that an empire built on fear, secrecy, and influence could survive even the harshest law enforcement efforts. As night fell over Liverpool, the calm streets concealed the ongoing presence of a hidden world. The docks, the warehouses, and even the renovated waterfront carried the faintest traces of an empire that had once ruled the city's shadows. Power, as the city had learned, never truly disappears, it merely shifts, hides, and waits. And somewhere beyond the reach of the law, the broker's legacy persisted, a silent reminder that the empire had never fully died, and the war beneath the surface was far from over.